Hello, everybody, and welcome to Jewish Renaissance's Journalism Inside Out session. We've been producing a series of talks together with the Union of Jewish Students, with the Jewish News, and with the support of the Dangle Foundation and the Lyons Learning Project over the last few weeks. A series of sessions all about what it means to be a journalist. These sessions were programmed and planned, and our Emerging Journalists course, which this evening session is partnered with, these were all programmed long before October the 7th. But over the last few weeks, for those of you who've been with us throughout, we found that they've taken on a new resonance, looking at the events of the last couple of months. It's no more true tonight. I mean, tonight probably more than anything, with this session on how we as Jewish journalists report on Israel. There's been all sorts of questions that have come back to us since we advertised this session by email and on social media. When we talked about clear-eyed reporting from the left and from the right, we've had questions on what does that mean? Is there possibilities of doing anything that's unbiased, comments on the publications that some of our journalists write for, questions about the professional, the personal and the ethical, and how they all combine. We are hoping for questions from you, our audience, and if you do want to ask something, please put it in the chat. But the panel tonight is going to be moderated, and initially the questions asked by our chairman, Jonathan Freedland, who, as I'm sure everyone watching this knows, is a journalist who has been absolutely active in this current war conflict coverage for the last 2 months on a daily basis across all sorts of different kinds of media. Jonathan's a Guardian columnist and a former foreign correspondent. He's the presenter of BBC Radio 4's contemporary history series, The Long View, as well as 2 other podcasts, Politics Weekly America for The Guardian and Unholy, which he co-chairs alongside the Israeli journalist Yonit Levy. He's the past winner of an Orwell Prize for Journalism and the author of 12 books, the latest being The Escape Artist, the man who broke out of Auschwitz to warn the world. And we're really delighted he's with us tonight to hold this conversation. He's going to be joined by our 4 guest speakers from all sorts of different kinds of publications. All are Jewish journalists, but between them, they write for quite a range of both Jewish and mainstream press, both in Israel and the diaspora. Richard Ferrer, who is our first speaker, is a British journalist and has been the editor of the Jewish News since 2009. And the Jewish News was named by the Society of Editors the free weekly newspaper of the year in 2021. He's also created and appeared on the Channel 4 programme Jewish Mum of the Year, and he's a regular contributor to programmes on BBC Radio 4. Tovah Lazaroff, who's joining him, is the deputy managing editor of the Jerusalem Post, where she's worked as a correspondent since 2000. Before she arrived in Israel in the year 2000, Tovah spent 8 years as a local reporter in the Boston area, where she earned awards from the New England Press Association and from the Massachusetts Press Association. And last but actually, there's 2 more, so not last at all, penultimately, but by no means least, we have Anshel Pfeffer, who I've been seeing pop up in all sorts of publications over the last few weeks and the last few years. But he's perhaps best known as senior correspondent and columnist for Haaretz, as well as the Israel correspondent for The Economist. As well as being a journalist, he is an author of books, and most recently his 2018 book was Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. So now, as truly last but not least, Shira Rubin. Shira is a journalist for the Washington Post based in Tel Aviv. She covers news from Israel, the Palestinian territories, and across the region of the Middle East. Before joining the Post, Shira Rubin worked as a freelance foreign correspondent from Israel, Jordan, France, Germany, and Britain. And at the height of the wave of Syrian migration to Europe, she reported from Turkey and Greece on the human smuggling networks and on the mental health crisis among refugee communities. I hope you'll agree with me. It's an unbelievably fantastic panel. Thank you so much for joining us. And Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Aviva, for that and for bringing us all together. There's a risk that this will turn into a group therapy session for 5 people who've been going through, I think, quite a similar and draining and demanding experience these last 2 months. But nevertheless, we're going to hope it will be not just useful for us, but hopefully useful for all of you listening. And it is a great pleasure to speak to and with such esteemed colleagues. You heard there, we're going to talk among ourselves for a while, and then of course we'll bring in questions. And I'll say at the top, even though this is billed as going through till 9:30 London time, it's possible we'll finish earlier then, partly because I'm aware we have colleagues working out of Israel for whom it is a late night there. And so we'll see how things go. Aviva introduced us all as Jewish journalists, and I want to just begin actually by, in some ways, defining our terms and put to all of you a question that often comes to me, which is, are you a Jewish journalist, or are you a journalist who happens to be Jewish? And each one of you, I want to take a minute from each of you on that question, and the complexities in it, and sometimes the answer might be both or neither, whatever. But let's just go round the clock face as it presents to me. It may look different to other people. The first face I come to is you, Richard Ferrer, here in London. Jewish journalist, or a journalist who happens to be Jewish?
Hi, Jonathan. You can hear me, of course.
I can, loud and clear, yeah.
Good. And good evening, everyone. Thank you, Aviva. Look, I began my role in Jewish News in 2009, in my late 30s. So I'd spent about 15 to 20 years not in Jewish media at all. And the disciplines and the exercises I learnt in my time in local newspapers. I used to cover local council meetings and you know, the proper sort of grassroots stuff that doesn't really get covered anymore in local newspapers. Well, there are no local newspapers, are there? So, you know, those disciplines, I think, were inculcated and ingrained in me. So when I got to then become an editor of a Jewish newspaper, my identity, I suppose, I felt I needed to protect it. I felt warmth and needing to put my arm around the community, while at the same time having those same disciplines very much in my mind and a very, very front of everything I did. So of course there's a huge responsibility being a Jewish journalist working in a Jewish community. I mean, you can write a story if you work for The Sun and never speak to the person again. You write a story about Jewish Care Nord or UJIA, next week you find yourself sat next to them at a fundraising dinner. So there are sensibilities, shall we say. It was touched upon, I just caught the tail end of Aviva's session just before this, and we were touching upon, can any newspaper really be objective? And I don't think anything can really be objective. Often the subjectivity of the reader kind of pollutes the objectivity of the output. So I think we are subjectively Jewish. What we have done since October the 7th, I think, has been as much a community service as it has been a community news reporting gathering operation. But what really struck me when I joined the Jewish News, I'll keep my answer as short as possible. I'm a reformed, progressive, totally secular Jew. I found myself getting more Jewish. I found, the culture and the language and the food and then the education, all the great stuff that Jewish life is. I kind of found myself re-engaging with it in a way that I'd never seen. I'd never seen it before. And I'd been to a Jewish school. I went to, I was brought up Jewish. My parents put me through the whole Jewish mincemeat. I went through the whole thing, but it wasn't until I became a Jewish journalist that I became Jewish. Weirdly.
That's a good answer, that last one. So it was being a Jewish journalist that made you more of a Jew. Tovah Lazaroff, there, you're in Jerusalem. I think you're deputy managing editor of the Jerusalem Post, which is a paper known to everybody watching this, I'm sure. I can think of lots of presumptions I have already about what your answer will be, but are you a Jewish journalist or a journalist who happens to be Jewish? You need to unmute, Tovah.
I guess I was a journalist before I was Jewish. So, and my name is Tovah Lazaroff. So it's like taking out a sign, say Jewish person in the room. Much like Richard, I started in local journalism in the United States, nothing Jewish about it except for my name. So within, I don't know, a week or two, maybe a month of being on the job, I got a call from a very concerned official explaining, how much they liked my work and how important it was, et cetera. There was just one problem, and that problem was my name. My name essentially let everybody know that I was Jewish. And by letting everybody know that I was Jewish, essentially I was inserting bias before anybody got to the first line of the story. The argument was that I needed to neutralize my name, say Jane Smith, right? Or make it up. In fact, they were so concerned about it, they wanted to talk to my editors to explain to them how and why I needed to change my byline. And I didn't really overthink it. I just immediately said, yeah, okay, no, thank you. Appreciate that. Going to let the reader decide if my work meets the test of objectivity, and I'm going to keep my name. So I guess in some ways, the decision to not be a Jewish journalist, no matter what publication you're working for, was really never mine by virtue of the name that I was given at birth, which, immediately helped me make certain ties with people and kept me from ever making ties with other people, right? So, there's certain things I can cover very well and certain things that are going to be harder for me. I think that's true no matter who you are, because ultimately you bring your background into the story, no matter how much you try and be objective. I think objective is less about inserting your background in who you are and much more about doing your best to approach a topic fairly. I don't, now that of course I work for the Jerusalem Post, I see that more as Israeli. I think there's a separate medium in the United States of Jewish journalism. I think that might be true in England as well, which is different than, say, representing an Israeli newspaper. In the Jerusalem Post, even though we're in English, is considered to be an Israeli newspaper because we're older than the state of Israel, and et cetera. I think 1932. I hope I don't have that wrong, but certainly, of course, you're identified with a Jewish state. So anyway. That's my answer.
I mean, that's a good answer. I just have to follow up. The person who called and said, change your name, were they an official in terms of the paper? Were they involved in owning?
No. They was a local town. Okay. They were on one of the boards. They actually meant it nicely. Like they didn't mean it. They didn't think they were asking me something that was anti-Semitic. Yeah. Like they really genuinely thought that, and it had a lot to do also with the perception of Jews as being liberal. Right. Yeah. So for example, if I wrote a story, which I actually did, about a Christian group trying to come into the schools vis-a-vis trying to convince, the students to abstain from sex, right, as possibly also a proselytizing, a proselytizing problem under the title, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, then the fact that my, name was Tovah Lazaroff made them think, right? So you'd be surprised where it came up as, as kind of maybe I had some bias there, right? Because Jews were known to be, more liberal, than say Christians on this topic. So, yeah. I mean, it kept coming up actually. But again, I think it's hard to talk to me for more than 2 minutes without realizing that actually I am Jewish. So it just sort of became the road I went down.
Very interesting. Thank you. Names. So Shira Rubin of the Washington Post. I don't know whether your name is as much of a giveaway as it is for Tovah. You'll tell us. But our first two speakers, Richard and Tovah, work for, in effect, Jewish newspapers, different kind. Obviously, one Israeli, as Tovah said. You work for the Washington Post. Your name identifies you a bit to people who would know. So to you, the same question. Jewish journalist who happens to be Jewish. Oh, yes, you need to unmute as well. Can you... It's not letting you unmute. It's not letting you unmute. Okay, while we ask our... There we are. I think you've done it.
I'm with you, yes.
Yeah, you are.
My name is very interesting, actually. I cover Israel and Palestinian territories. So it is not like Tovah in some ways. I can use it, if I'm interviewing Israelis. Shockingly to me still, they're always asking if I'm Jewish, because it's almost kind of unbelievable to them that the two things can exist in one, even though I also am Israeli, but that's besides the point. So that's one side of things. And then I cover a lot of Palestinian issues as well. I speak Arabic as well. And when I go to the West Bank, for example, my name either gives me away or people just don't hear it. They just Arabize it. They just call me Shiri and then make up some other name for myself. So it's very complicated. I think I do not see myself as a Jewish journalist because people who would use that phrase in relation to me, maybe similar to your experience, Tovah, I've found to be kind of the most shallow understanding of the work I do. And I do feel 1000% Jewish and a journalist, but I would not necessarily make the kind of connection between the two as both equal parts of my identity. I think it does allow me to see things in certain ways and maybe not see things in other ways. I agree, objectivity is something that is maybe something to strive for, but an ideal. And I don't necessarily think bias is a problem. It could be something that we look at and deal with and navigate through, because we all deal with it and we all have it. Which is all to say that I am a Jewish journalist, but I don't think of myself that way, even though I know that I am.
Yeah, and then you've introduced a whole other thing there, which is, of course, or both of you and Tovah have, which is how, regardless of what you think of how you see yourself, how others see you, which is very important. So we've talked to people who work for Jewish newspapers and people who work for papers that are not Jewish. And now in Anshel Pfeffer, we have somebody who does both and in multiple ways, because Anshel, you are the correspondent for the Jewish Chronicle and for Haaretz, but also the Economist and the Times/Sunday Times of London. You are walking many divides and straddling many fault lines, but nevertheless, you will have an answer, I guess, to this question: Jewish journalist or journalist who happens to be Jewish. Oh, and you need to unmute too. Sorry, Anshel.
Yeah, I have a very short answer, Jonathan. I've never considered myself as being anything else than a Jewish journalist. I don't think I even thought of the question until you brought it up. So that's the short answer. The longer answer is, I think, the question that you're raising is, do we write with our identities? And we have multiple identities. On the shelf behind me is the picture of David Landau, my mentor, and
just explain who he was to people who might not be familiar with him.
Editor-in-chief of Haaretz. Before that, he founded the English edition of Haaretz. And when I first met David, I had never written a word in English professionally. And David said to me, you're British. You were born in Britain. Your English is perfect. Why aren't you writing in English as well? And he was constantly badgering me in his lovable way, but very insistful way, that I write pieces for the English edition of Haaretz, as well as writing. At the time, I was education correspondent for Haaretz, and it didn't occur to me to write in English, even though it's one of the languages I speak fluently. And it was just so clear to him that you don't, you use everything you have, and it is being British is one of my identities. But to me, journalism was, at least in the first years of my career, trying to run away from my identities. I had chosen to be a journalist after basically dropping out of yeshiva, of a rabbinical seminary. I was 2/3 of the way to becoming a rabbi. I was already a qualified teacher of Talmud. And I decided I don't want to do any of that. And I really wanted to be a journalist. And I went to the biggest local newspaper in Jerusalem and said, I want to work here. And after a few interviews and a couple of tests, they said, okay, but we only have one beat that's not currently occupied, and that's covering religion and the Haredi community in Jerusalem. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I just left yeshiva. The last thing I wanted is to go back into that world. But I wanted to be a journalist. That was the only place that was offered to me at the time. So I went into it anyway. And ever since, I've felt that writing about Judaism in all its glorious and inglorious forms is, to me, one of the most interesting things that I do. I do a lot of things as a journalist, but that to me is always the most fascinating thing. And I find that very often when I'm covering a story which may not necessarily seem to be connected to anything to do with Jews or to do with religion, it always is an element. I think it's an element that many reporters, certainly in the West, miss a lot of the time, the importance of religion. But just my Jewish identity, which I've accepted in a very few cases in a small number of Arab countries, and even there, I've rarely hidden it. It's always opened up doors for me, and it's always made people interested in talking to me. It's equipped me with a huge number of sources who you wouldn't think would be relevant to the story, but you always find that, you know, this sort of, and we have to obviously whisper it, but this sort of secret society that we have, this Freemasons kind of secret handshakes that we have as Jews, also equips us as journalists with a lot of contacts, which, you know, you should always use everything you have. You should use all your identities and all your languages and all your connections. And going back to your original question, it never occurred to me to be anything other than a Jewish journalist, and I always will be.
A reminder that our conversation is being recorded and little clips of it may appear on social media just when you're talking like that, Anshel. No, I completely understand what you mean. For what it's worth, my answer to the question would always have been like yours, Shira, that I would never have thought of it as, I would always say, a journalist who happens to be Jewish. In recent years, I've come to realize, in the line of all of you have been saying, you can't separate out these things. So even when I was writing, for example, about Donald Trump, I think there was a Jewish sensibility that was alerted earlier than other journalists that realized we've seen this kind of character before, the authoritarian who is threatening, etc. There was a Jewish antenna there that meant, in a way, even though I would, you know, as Anshel said, nothing about Jews would be in the actual column, there was something about a Jewish sort of sense of sensitivity or sensibility that was alerted. And so in some ways, we're always a Jewish journalist, even if we're writing in another way. So the way I want this to work is a conversation with all of us where we react to each other. You don't have to wait for a question from me. I want anybody to chip in on this. Partly why this discussion now is so timely is because of what's happened since October the 7th. And we are, I said before in an earlier session with emerging Jewish journalists or journalists who happen to be Jewish, that I had found that writing about this war, you know, reporting on it directly, being in Israel a couple of weeks ago, is one of the perhaps the most challenging stories ever to write about. This is digging into something very, very painful and very deep for me, and I think for everyone doing it. And so I want to sort of touch on that a bit and to ask where all of us feel the pressures are on us at the moment. Where are we feeling the pressure? I look at you, Tovah, and just imagine you're writing for a paper that, yes, has an Israeli audience, but also is read by diplomats and journalists and others in Jerusalem and people around the world. Shira, you'll have an audience of policymakers in Washington. Anshel, you're writing for multiple audiences. Richard, you're there with the Jewish community in Britain that I'm expecting has a certain need to hear certain things from you. What are the pressures on you at the moment? What are the needs you're feeling that are there among your readers? And how are you managing to meet them. And I say this partly because I think, and it would be good if this emerges, the story that is being told is somebody, you know, my colleague on my co-host on Unholy, Yoni Levy, said to me at one point, the war you're seeing on CNN and the BBC is not the war we're seeing on Israeli TV, literally in terms of the pictures, the suffering, the imagery. So I just throw that all out. You know, where are the pressures on each of you coming from, and how are you managing them? I don't know who would like to go first, but I'd love to hear all four of you on that. Richard puts his hand up first, and Anshel is smiling in such a way that makes me think he's got thoughts. But you go ahead, Richard, and any one of the other three respond when you've heard Richard say something. Oh, and you need to unmute again, Richard.
Now you can.
There we are. Good. I'm just going to have a word with our technical sponsors here, and just to say maybe it's good to keep all speakers unmuted so they can chip in freely, because otherwise it's going to be a little bit stop-start. So, Richard, off you go.
On that.
Well, first I want to say that I feel like somewhat of an imposter because I'm on a panel with journalists that are actually there on the ground in Israel, living and breathing the daily pressures. So I feel like somewhat unworthy. However, as you do allude to, and as you know as well as I do, the British Jewish community here has its own fights and its own battles and its own issues that it's having to deal with, and has done ever since October the 7th. October the 7th feels like a lifetime ago, to be occupied by such trivialities as judicial reform. If anyone remembers that, that was a long, long time ago now.
And we'll come back to that, by the way, because I think there's things to talk about. But on you go, Rich.
Look, I think the first few weeks we were all in shock. Ever since that 8 o'clock Zoom, I remember it vividly on the Saturday morning when we were all kind of, you know, just sat there kind of aghast, waiting to see what was going to happen. And really, me and my team, and we're a very small team, you know, we're a local newspaper setup, have not really stopped or slept since. I'd say the first week or two was defined by the national and international media coming to us for our contacts, particularly around these awful stories of expats and British victims and families that are kidnapped. Nathaniel Young, who died, I think, with about 20 of his unit on October the 7th, was the first British victim. We worked and liaised with a lot of the British media to tell his story. So we found ourselves coordinating coverage outside the community, which was a shock to the system. And we also have organised events that the national media has covered themselves. We did a Bring Them Home balloon release in 20 cities around the world to keep the hostages front and centre of people's minds. You may have seen we collaborated with 30 Jewish medias around the world. We published the same joint editorial. That was
but Richard, this is all great, but I want to push you on the pressure. What is there pressure from the Jewish community for you to be giving them a particular story, whether that's reassuring news, good news, to be talking about the victims on October 7th rather than the casualties in Gaza now, because your readers are already getting that on the BBC and Sky? Just talk me through the pressures.
There are pressures, of course. The temperature has risen in a way that you can't imagine. But with that pressure, I think, comes a sort of sense of paranoia. And that paranoia is something I'm trying desperately, and I know my colleagues are too, to manage. In this highly intense time when obviously there's pressure, and you speak to the UJS, Life for Jewish students on campus, and on the high streets of Jewish London, there are intense pressures and paranoias. But I think we need to keep moving the conversation forward in a constructive way. There are so many echo chambers. We do a lot of work online on social media. Social media has now become a twilight zone. And that's where we're doing a lot of our work, I think, to try and make sure that the opinion that we put forward isn't radical, because I think that makes things even far worse on the streets. I think it's critical that the Jewish news is seen to reject blanket language. the police are doing terrible things, the marchers all hate Jews. I think we need to build constructive bridges, and that can be very, very difficult. It's very difficult to divorce your emotions, disconnect your anger. Are you a Jew, or are you a Jewish journalist, or a journalist who's a Jew? At a time like this, it's very difficult to be anything other than a Jew, a Jew who's a journalist, because you're suffering the same trauma, the same dread, the same issues of the people that you're interviewing, the people that you're reporting on. So it can be very difficult to provide that crucial sense of moderation, produce balance, and unemotive news coverage at a time of heightened emotions. So I'd say that's my great challenge.
Yeah, no, I get it. And when you say paranoia, you mean Jews who are really fearful about anti-Semitism and the like?
The rally a week ago last Sunday was attended. Well, police will tell you 60,000. The organisers will tell you 105,000. But I can't tell you how many people were just absolutely paranoid, would not go out onto the streets of London. This is not a message that we want to be conveying, and we need to find a sensible coalition, a common ground of rational minds, because there will be a day after tomorrow. This will end, and we need to start picking up the pieces.
Who wants to respond to that?
Yeah, Richard, what you say about feeling that you're not in the center of this. I mean, I think it is just another center. And also, the paranoia and the kind of psychological element is definitely true for all of us Israelis covering this as well. It's a different kind of dread, but a real dread, which is very difficult to even conceptualize now that we're in this war and everything has just been kind of accelerated so that we almost went past some phases of like understanding October 7th. I'm curious if you think, Richard, this is new, completely new, or just a new magnitude of what you had seen before, because I know, every time that there are wars, there is that kind of typical backlash among diaspora. But I mean, I think for myself, we have 1,000 pressures, every day. There's just, I can't even name all of them. But what has been my personal pressure is just the level of denialism, which I had just never expected, which is both coming from readers, readers who are emailing me personally or messaging on my articles, just flat out denying things that happened on October 7th. Sorry, Jonathan, do you want to?
No, I really wanted, you've already done it, but I wanted to clarify, were they denying the atrocities of October 7th, or are they denying the casualty figures in Gaza now? But you answered it because you said October 7th. So tell us more about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, there's so much information out there. There's so much out there, I think, more than ever before. And just the world is captivated. We have so many wars. This is not new at all. But obviously the magnitude and the level and the fact that there was an October 7th in this one. I mean, we know kind of the scenarios of Gaza. We've seen them 1,000 times before, but this one was preceded by the worst tragedy to befall the Jewish people since the Holocaust. So that changes the entire framing of the war itself. The pressures that I'm getting from readers, and actually in some ways from my own newsroom, is a kind of, it's not exactly a disbelief, because in some ways it's so hard for me to believe it too. It's amazing. It's something that none of us had in our imagination was possible. It's not even a nightmare, because no one would have had that nightmare. But there is this denialism about atrocities. And I think the only real response is to do just the most rigorous possible reporting, and to get out and to be very honest about what we know for a fact, what we do not know, what we will learn, because these are developing stories that really none of us have the capacity to treat as one. I mean, it's so many stories at the same time, and we're all short-staffed, I think. We're all working nonstop since October 7th. I don't think any of us have really had a break, let alone had the time to kind of digest any of this trauma. And you said at the beginning, this is probably going to be some sort of therapy session, because I think none of us have even had a moment to, even understand the depths of any of this. So, I mean, I think in some ways as a journalist, and this goes back to your original question of Jewish journalists, there is some sort of power in being able to kind of set the record and bear witness. And that is a very Jewish thing, to bear witness. And it's
you were one of the writers of a very important piece published in the Washington Post on the sexual violence that occurred on October the 7th. Very detailed, very, very hard to read, based on all kinds of interviews and documentary evidence and the video footage and so on. Just to clarify, and then I'm going to bring in Anshel and Tovah, but the denialism you're describing that has greeted some of your reporting, has some of that focused in particular on the sexual violence? So much.
And it in some ways, I did the story because I had reported on sexual violence previously in other articles, not as the focus, but just as part of the atrocities that we knew from testimonies and from witnesses. We knew were part of it. And so in some ways, the story itself was a response to that, to kind of just lay out what we have, what we don't have, what we might learn, what we could learn, what we probably will never learn, because most of the victims, we believe, were killed right after sexual violent acts. And yes, there was a lot of denialism in response to that story. However, I would say my editors told me it was potentially the most widely read story of the entire conflict. And it brought a lot of new subscribers. And I've gotten dozens, maybe more emails that I had never gotten before, which were very simple. Just, thank you. We are interested. We want to know. That's it. And that's, for me, that's very satisfying, because it's very difficult to know what our worth is right now in this kind of storm of news. And we ourselves are dealing with a lot. So yeah, the denialism was there on one hand. On the other hand, there was a lot of, I think, appreciation, because there are these kind of very extremist voices out there using these stories, for example, of rape in their own narratives. So they wanted to hear it from a source that reported it rigorously, was able to, lay it out and just give them the story. And that's, I think, what they did appreciate in the end.
Yeah. Anshel, Tovah, pressures on you, how you manage them?
I think that we should also kind of look beyond our profession and understand that this is a very pressuring time to be here in a country at war. And in a way, I think that if I didn't have a job which allows me to go out, both to go out and report, and also sometimes just sit at home and think and write more pieces which are broader or more analytical or more commentary, and to both experience and to write about what's happening from different angles, I think it would be much more difficult for me if I was just a small business owner struggling to keep it afloat during the war, or if I was a bit younger and still doing miluim and having to kind of work between wherever I would have been sent as a soldier and my family and my job was 360,000 miliyimnikim. So let's not glamour. We tend to glamorize our work. There are much worse things and much more difficult things right now in Israel than being a journalist. So okay, we're here to talk about journalism. I'm not trying to get away.
No, good. It's a good point. I do understand that, and also we've got the chance, at least I've been saying this in conversations I've been having, to metabolize and process all the feelings we're all going through by putting them on paper. And a lot of people are just churning up with this stuff and have nowhere to put it. So I completely take your point. Nevertheless, there will be specific demands put on you from Jewish Chronicle readers, Haaretz readers, Economist readers, and those demands may push you in different directions. But you tell us.
Listen, I'm not, even though we're among friends, there's certain things I can't say about inner workings of the various news organizations I work for. I'll just say one thing. I think that, we said before, are you a Jewish journalist, or a journalist happens to be a Jew? This is one of the periods in which professionalism is your best defense, is your best protection. And you see when you're working for different news organizations, and some of them are big and have a number of editors that you work with, some of them are small and only have one or two, you see the difference, and the pressures come from those who are not professional, or not experienced, or just not. I'm lucky that most of the editors I work for are really, really pros, and it's another thing we should bear in mind about our work. We don't work alone, even if we are. And there's one editor here, but the rest of us have the bylines and have the public presence. But the byline is just one person who's part of a much bigger editorial team. And we work with fantastic photographers, and we work with various other support staff, and we have excellent. Usually, in my case, I have usually excellent editors backing me up. And really, I think at the end of the day, the job of a good editor is to protect you from pressures. I won't say here the cases where I do have to face pressures, because that's between me and the various editors I work with.
Yeah, I wasn't meaning the editors particularly. I was actually meaning readers, where you feel. Well, I was picturing, for example, that readers of Jewish or Hebrew papers want you to be focusing on October 7, and readers of papers outside, for example, The Economist or Sunday Times, think the story is now the bombardment of Gaza. That was the thing I imagined, but you might be wrong. I might be wrong.
I'm the wrong. I'm a 50-year-old granddad with a very thick skin, and I don't give a shit about if a reader wants me to go take this thing. I've been doing this job for most of my life, and it's not worth doing it if you don't write the angles that interest you and the emphasis that interest you, which you think as a professional and as a person that are the important ones. Maybe I should be more mindful of what readers are thinking. That's not how I've done it, and I don't. I spend time on Twitter because I like the jousting, but I'm really not that bothered about what readers think, because editors think I'm good enough. They employ me, they pay. Usually they pay on time. I think that we don't have to be that obsessed about what readers say, because most of the time the readers that we're hearing from are not representative of most of our readers. Certainly the people who are commenting on places like Twitter, or apparently it's called something like X now. So once again, it boils down to what you are as a professional. If you have a clear idea of what your job is and what makes a story and what's important to report, I think you can withstand the pressures from readers. And most of them don't meet me. Anybody who comes up to me in the street is almost always going to say something nice. Occasionally someone will say I'm a twat, but that's a minority, and I can live with it.
Very good. I want to open up to our, I'm not going to say readers, but our audience's questions, because lots of good ones are coming in. But Tovah, just how the view from Jerusalem and the Jerusalem Post, the pressures on you, how you're managing them, and then we've got lots of good questions coming in. So I just want to hear you on that topic. And you need to unmute as well, yeah. Again, I'm going to say to our hosts, do please keep all the panelists unmuted, because then we can all chip in. So if you unmute Anshel and Shira, that will be good. Yeah.
Yes. So now I'm unmuted. Sorry about that. Look, I think that in a way, it's easier to be an Israeli journalist right now than it is to be almost anywhere else, because you have an audience that's already bought into the storyline that right? So if I've been reporting on the story of Gaza, so to speak, for 20 years, from the perspective of Israelis, then, that is also what my audience knows, right? So if you took a poll of a lot of the Washington Post readers, probably they don't remember what disengagement is, but everybody in my audience knows about it, right? So I live in a country that is totally focused on a certain storyline, and then I'm trying to bring that storyline, to the readers who are reading my paper, and many of whom are coming to my site to see that storyline. So it's it's simpler in a way. And, I've been at a dead run since the start. So really my biggest worry every day is just how to get the basic news out, because there's so much of it and there just isn't enough time. There's enough resources to get it all out. And there's so many pieces of it that if you miss some of them, the responsibility of bearing witness, right, I think is the thing that weighs the most heavily. But I also think that there's a reason why certain dialogues are happening, right? It isn't, there's this war, and the criticism of it, exists on two levels. One is the issue of anti-Semitism and how that's merged with this war. And the second is the very real thing that you do have many, many Palestinians who've been killed. And so I think the challenge, if you're an Israeli newspaper, is to make sure that those deaths aren't anesthetized, that they don't all fall under some category of enemy, and that people are aware of the cost of the war on the other side, and how you help the reader understand how and why that has become part of the dialogue, and really increasingly where everyone is focused.
Thank you. Let's open up now to questions that have been coming in. As you know, that there is also a program, Jewish Renaissance, run for emerging journalists, and one of those, Arturo, has a question directed particularly at Anshel and Shira, which is: are you frustrated by the limitations on access to Gaza for reporters? Did the regional isolation of Israeli journalists prevent Israeli society and its political guardians from seeing October the 7th coming on the horizon? So merging two things there. Are you frustrated by the degree of access you have to Gaza? And implied there from Arturo's question that in some ways Israeli journalists are cut off from the region, and therefore in some ways are partly that contributed to Israel not seeing what was coming on October the 7th. Shira, why don't you take that one first, and we'll hear Anshel as well on that.
I think the access to Gaza is a big problem. I'm part of like a 10-person team. So because of so many reasons, it would not personally be me going into Gaza probably to cover it, besides an embed, which they have done, and they have done it for us.
Embed, we should explain, is when a journalist is embedded with the IDF and go in under their protection, as it were.
So access is huge. It's in all of our interests to have transparency on that as well. The second question is Israel's disconnection from the region what led to it not understanding the depth of the Hamas
and particularly this point of journalists being disconnected from, for not necessarily not through any failure on their part, but the phrase used by Arturo is regional isolation of Israeli journalists.
Yeah, I think it is a really big black hole. I'm Israeli, so I go into the West Bank a lot, just even before this war, but they have no visibility there, even the West Bank, which is so close, and not to speak of Gaza. And almost, it's as if almost we're still stuck on like October 8th. It's almost like a time freeze that is not kind of matched up to what is happening on the ground. And I think it is a big problem. It is a very serious problem. And it is something that I think Israel has not been able to it kind of reflects Israel's greater issue with Palestinians, which is that there's no visibility. It's almost as if both sides, they just don't see each other. It's not even don't understand each other. There's just kind of no, although Palestinians do see Israeli media, and they do cite Israeli media. So they have a little bit better sense of what the narrative is here. But there's so many Palestinians of the younger generation who have never met an Israeli besides a soldier or a settler. So there is also a huge visibility issue, I think, just all around, especially for Israelis though, who have been able to afford for themselves to be complacent in that way in the past more than 10 years.
Tovah, just because you're our newspaper executive there as deputy managing editor, Shira's impression is that she just doesn't see Israeli media on the West Bank or outside, its own, I'm not going to say bubble, but you know what we mean. Is that your impression? Does the Jerusalem Post recognize what you've just heard Shira say is her impression of the disconnect between Israeli media and, for example, the West Bank?
I think the West Bank is a very complex place. I mean, the West Bank has, settlements in it. It's got Palestinian cities in it. I think the Israeli media goes all around the West Bank, both inside and outside. I think Israel is very aware of the Palestinian story. I think the issue is much more humanizing it, less knowing it. I think that probably Israeli media does a better job at showing, sort of, speaking to Palestinians, and say the Palestinian media does speaking to Israelis. You'll definitely see like Israeli reporters, in Palestinian areas talking to Palestinians. I mean, the issue of not being able to go into Gaza and not being safe to have access to Gaza, I think that definitely presents a huge challenge. But I wanted to actually answer there was another piece of your question. I think part of what happened, on the lead up to October 7th is not that people were unaware that such an attack could happen, but rather they had an overconfident sense of the protection at the border. Like I remember a story about how Hamas had built some kind of a fake Israeli town and that they were actually training to take it over. I didn't think so much about it because I just imagined they couldn't breach that border. So like that breach was the fantasy, not the intent or the thought that they could do that. And obviously the level of atrocity was not.
I'd like to dispute what Shira said. Israeli media has done an excellent job in the last 8 weeks, and I'm not just talking about Haaretz, which is obviously my home base. Israeli media, lots of news organizations, have been tirelessly reporting the failures of the IDF. I mean, the New York Times wrote a piece a few days ago with this incredible scoop of some plan that it's been in Israeli media already for 3 weeks. And I mean, there's some incredible work, tireless work in dangerous situations to uncover all the ways in which Israelis were abandoned on the kibbutzim on October 7th, all the failures of intelligence. I mean, just the scope of what the Israeli media has done in telling the stories of 1,200 victims and the families of 250 captives. It's mind-boggling, and we're a tiny news organization. I think Israeli journalism has a lot of failures, and there's things we could have done better in the last 8.5 weeks of this war. I think we've done an incredible job, and I say we. I don't just mean my snobby friends at the Haaretz, who are the best, obviously. I mean, like everything from to local and websites, and I mean, when the story of this war is told, there is already so much material which was gathered in some you talked before about the pressures. Some of my, I half the time spend writing analysis. There's been such incredible reporting by Israeli journalism, and all these stories of whether it's the rape and the sexual assault stories, which are now coming. There's been so much legwork done by Israeli journalists in the last 8.5 weeks on this, and thankfully, most of it has been done responsibly. Without, I mean, there have been a few cases.
Let me, because in Shira's defense, I think the question was, hold on one second, Anshel. I think the question was particularly about coverage of the West Bank and of Palestinian life, rather than the brilliant work you're referring to in terms of getting underneath what happened on October 7th. But Shira, you can defend yourself. Come back on this, and then we'll go to another question.
I don't want to drag out I know we have limited time as well. I wasn't saying that Israeli military analysts and Israeli journalists who are looking at the war have failed in not going deeply into it. The opposite, with all of the limitations that exist on international, and even more in a lot of ways more, because the censors are more strict, I sense. I mean, I understand from the Israeli journalist perspective. with all of those limitations, and we are in a war, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily going to be possible for people to physically, go into a place that is objectively dangerous. So with all of the complication of that, I did not mean that Israeli journalists are not working rigorously to tell the story of the war and the other side of the war. But there is kind of a there is a visibility issue for all of us, for international press too. There is a visibility issue, which is actually typical of also other wars, which is that there's just no access for a lot of reasons. And also, the West Bank, I think, is a totally different story. But Gaza, Israeli journalists are not physically able to go there. They're not able to go and talk to people, even if they are able to talk to people that they, had interviewed years before the disengagement. There is still kind of an open line of communication between academics and journalists on both sides, that you can still get information, but it's difficult. I totally respect Israeli journalism, and actually, because in spite of it being such a small kind of sector, it's so vibrant and so, I think, so accomplished. Even if, let's say, for example, if the IDF censor is trying to limit it or limit stories, they are successful in bringing stories out, obviously. I myself, using them as sources, I totally respect them.
Very good, and thank you for being, both of you, very candid about that, and it's good that we aired that. I want to bring some other questions from our audience, and this one might be for you, Richard. Are the panelists surprised that the BBC News coverage appears so unbalanced and, Justin adds, unsympathetic to Israel's position since October the 7th? He then says, what can be done about it? I'd be very interested to know if any of you or some of you feel that is even an appropriate question, the last bit, for journalists to answer, as in what can be done about the what Justin says is a lack of sympathy in the coverage. Justin has mentioned the BBC, but you could easily, others would add in Sky News or CNN or whatever. Richard, you go first with the BBC, and then Tovah, I might come to you on this question of whether you feel international news agencies, and I'm thinking of television in particular, has been, as Justin suggests, unbalanced. But Richard first on the BBC, and Justin saying, why so unbalanced? What can be done about it?
We've covered these campaigns outside the BBC. I think that they are a distraction. I don't think that they are something that we need to focus on now. We understand why the BBC are doing it. To be honest, the BBC's coverage between, say, October the 7th and a week later was, I think, exemplary. They told the story, they covered it. We knew when we were watching that coverage that as the days moved on and we moved further and further away from those 24 or 36 hours of hell, that the news cycle would move on, and with it, memories are short. And while it remains burnished on our minds and front and center of everything that's happening every minute of the day, the news cycle would move on, and the BBC have had to cover events as they currently stand. Now, I know John Simpson has been very vocal about holding the line, and we can't call a terrorist. And of course, if the King and the Prime Minister can call a terrorist, why can't the BBC? They have moved slightly, saying they're now defined as a terrorist organisation by the British government, which is something of a mouthful for anyone to say, but at least that's moving the dial slightly. But sorry, you were going to say?
No, I was actually just coughing. But the second bit Justin added was, what can be done about it? Do you feel that on the pages of the Jewish News, part of your job is to push the BBC to be a bit more, Justin's word, sympathetic, as some of your readers will be wanting you to do? Do you feel that that's part of your role, to be an advocate in pushing other bits of the media to be, quotes, more sympathetic?
It is. I'd say it's the number one phone call that we've been having time after time. My mail sack is full of these emails asking us what we're going to do about it, and are we going to heap pressure on it, and do we do a campaign? Look, you don't do a campaign unless you think you can win it. and you understand from the outset that you're going to get somewhere with it. I think this is an ongoing issue. I know there's been massive inconsistencies, as you'll be aware. There was the report, I think, around the 20th of October when 2 people were shot around a football match in Sweden, I think it was, and the gunman was actually called a terrorist by the BBC. So there's massive inconsistencies, I think, that really rankle with the Jewish community. But as I said at the outset, I think an objective news organization is often seen subjectively through the lens of the viewer in terms of where their perspective is. And, you know, you won't be surprised, I'm sure you know, that there's a lot of people who don't have a nice word to say about Israel that think that the BBC is pro-Israel. Which is preposterous as far as we can tell. But in terms of the misuse of language and the betrayal of what we have seen, I mean, no state in the history of warfare has had to face the horror that Israel is facing. 10-month-old babies kidnapped, 3-year-old children kidnapped and orphaned. No, there is no psychological precedent for what Israel and the Israelis are currently going through. But for the BBC not to call that terrorism, yeah, it's inhumane, is my opinion. But I understand what they're doing, and I don't think it's number one on our priority list of what's important now in terms of protecting and supporting and standing up for the Jewish community.
Thank you. Tovah, there's a related question here. It is related from Ian Lucas. There appears a distinct failure in the media, again, I think he means international media, of understanding October the 7th, which has been overtaken by the optics of the flattening of Gaza and Khan Yunis. This really is about good versus evil, not another skirmish between Israelis and Palestinians. I've yet to see an attempt by the Jewish newspapers to counter the amount of fake news in the intelligent press. What's your just on the point at the beginning of Ian Lucas's question, which is October the 7th overtaken by the optics of the flattening of Gaza and Khan Yunis? Is that, to your mind, the big difference between the way this story is seen internationally and the way you, the Jerusalem Post, and perhaps the other Israeli newspapers are reporting it? In other words, if you watch the BBC, Sky, CNN, so on, October the 7th was then, and now it's about, Ian Lucas's words, flattening of Gaza. Whereas in Israel, in the media coverage, as I think Shira said before, it's still October the 7th. And there's been this kind of time freeze. Is that the distinction? And then I'll bring in Anshel and Shira on that.
Well, I think it's not just the distinction for the media. I think it's the international distinction, you know, on every level, which is when October 7th happened, you know, people were ready to be horrified for Israel. They wanted to grieve with Israel. You saw, you know, Macron raced here, you know, I'm with you, I stand with you. You know, Biden came, everybody came. I think to a certain extent, you know, if Israel had, if you forget about the rockets for a minute, right? If Israel had regained control of the territory, right? Made sure that there were no more Hamas terrorists and resecured its border and stopped there, okay, then I think you would have seen an enormous pouring of sympathy for Israel and a continuation of that pouring, right? I'm not saying that that is what Israel should have done, as much as, you know, by default, the moment that it went on the offensive, when it saw October 7th as an existential threat, then, you know, it created a second storyline, and that storyline is in Gaza, right? And what everybody's talking about really now, even as they're still talking about the hostages and the whole issue of the women, is the human cost of what it might mean to secure Israel. And there's I don't see how you get out of that loop to a certain extent, except to end the war, because
no, this was exactly the disconnect I had in mind when I put my first question to you, Anshel, because I'm imagining your Haaretz and Jewish Chronicle readers are still in October the 7th, and your Economist and Sunday Times readers are looking, as Ian Lucas says, are those pictures of the flattening of Gaza. And therefore, you have to meet your readers where they are. And you've got two sets of readers whose starting points are very different in exactly the way the questioner identifies. Am I right about that?
Well, you have to remember that Haaretz, I write both in Hebrew and in English. And Haaretz is the oldest Hebrew newspaper in the world and the oldest Israeli newspaper in the world, the best, obviously. But thanks to David Landau, for the last 27 years, we've also had an English edition, which has an incredible reach and makes us basically the most widely read Jewish and Israeli newspaper around the world. And that is, so I'm, even within my work for Haaretz, I'm constantly in this sort of dialogue. I mean, I don't really do a dialogue with readers, but I'm writing for readers who are both in Israel speaking Hebrew, and they could be anywhere in the world. And our numbers, everybody's numbers have gone up. But since we also sell, since we have a paywall and we have a subscription, and we've had thousands of new subscriptions every week. And that, sadly, we won't retain any of them after the war, probably. But anyway, and this. The optics of something like flattening Gaza, a Gaza flattened, I think are hugely important to all the audiences, because, and you know, Shira was a bit dismissive of embeds. I think embeds are hugely valuable because, you know, this is a war. I need to see what the army is doing, and the army doesn't control me when I'm in. I was in 2 embeds, and the army couldn't prevent me from seeing the fact. The second time I went into Shati, especially a couple of weeks ago, that Gaza City had been flattened. The city of 1 million people had been flattened. This is a city which is uninhabitable. It's a city which is as big as my hometown of Jerusalem, bigger than that place called Tel Aviv, which I don't think much of. And it's been rendered uninhabitable. 1.2 or 3 million people have been forced out of the greater Gaza City area. And that is something that, even though I was reading about it and seeing photographs, you don't grasp it until you're actually on the ground there. And it doesn't matter if you're an embed, you feel it. And that was, I think, according to the number crunchers, the piece I wrote after that in Haaretz, both in Hebrew and English, were the piece that got the most readers of any of the pieces I wrote in Haaretz in this war. And it's essential to explain that to readers. And I think that saying that Gaza City has been destroyed and has been flattened is, I think, also something that you don't have to take a position on whether it's justified or not justified, and could Israel do something else or not. You know, that is something that people who are 100% in support of everything that has happened, everything Israel's done, obviously, since October 7, or people who think that Israel's carrying out the most terrible war crimes. I think that's an essential thing that we need to understand, what the price of this, you know, of this thing is for. It's like I say one quick thing about something that Richard said. I'm sorry, but there is a precedent to what's happened with the kidnap of babies. Russia has kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian children as a policy. We're not always, we're Jews, we're the most important thing. Israel's the most interesting country in the world. You know, it's important also to see that there are patterns here recurring. Us is rape as a tool of war. Us is the kidnap of small children. We're not, you know, it's very important that we keep that in mind. And you know, I spent a lot of time last year writing about Ukraine and reporting. I would like to spend more time, but our Haaretz resources are limited. But I made a couple of reporting trips to Ukraine. I think that we do have to, also because there's a tendency to say this is the worst thing on both sides. People are saying this is the worst casualty. The New York Times had this stupid piece saying how this is the highest casualties in a war in the 21st century. Just in Mariupol, more people were killed, but because the UN only records confirmed numbers, so you know that's not on the list. Now, that's not to belittle the 10,000 civilians who have been killed in Gaza out of the 16,000 estimated. But we really have to also, I think, professionally to report this war, both as Jewish journalists, but also professionals who know that there are wars happening in other places. And that kind of brings me to the BBC. I think the BBC does an excellent job of covering wars in general. But the BBC is made up of human beings. And the biases exhibited by BBC reporters and other news staff are the biases of middle-class, well-educated English people, which are not always very friendly towards Israelis.
We are approaching the end of our time together. I wondered if I could ask each of you a final question, which will be, what do you think? I'll tell you what it's prompted by. It was prompted by a question from one member of the audience who said, at some point, perhaps afterwards, they see there being a shift in reporting? And the questioner wondered about whether Jewish and Israeli audiences would be ready once the war, in a way, is finished, to explore the impact of the the question was devastation in Gaza. I want to broaden that out, though, and think, what do you imagine when the immediate current phase of this war is drawn to a close? What do you imagine you'll be then reporting on, and what you'll be looking at in a way in the aftermath? Whether what you'll be probing, whether it will be the intelligence failures that led to this, or more on the stories of October the 7th, or the impact on Gaza. Where do you think your journalistic energies will be? And more generally than that, do you think anything about this extraordinary period we're all living through and covering will have changed how you approach being a journalist, your work as journalists? So I've put a lot in there because these are closing thoughts. Why don't we hear a closing thought from, I'm going to go around the clock again as it looks to me. I'll start with you, Richard. What do you think you'll do afterwards? How's this changed you as a journalist? And let's do a sort of minute or so each so that we can wrap up.
In 60 seconds, you want me to answer that? Good grief.
You can go a tiny bit longer.
What will I do? What will we do? We will, when this is over, we will mourn the dead. We will pay tribute to them in the best possible way that we can, and I think that will take months and years. We'll do everything we can to support the bereaved in this country and their families in Israel. We need to find a modicum of common ground, I think, between the Jewish community, which is so often made to feel defined by anti-Semitism. I've found that through Corbyn and the 2014 conflict, constantly being told to be defined by anti-Semitism. So I'd like to move away from that as quickly as possible, because right now that's how we are feeling defined, and make British Jews define themselves by their accomplishments and their contribution to British life, which is what I find is my main purpose in life as the editor of the Jewish News. So I want to reposition the Jewish community away from hatred and bigotry and that sort of element of intolerance. And yeah, I want to pay tribute to those we've lost, and help remend the Jewish community in the UK and across the diaspora.
Very good, and not much more than a minute. You did it, Richard.
Okay.
Tovah, to you.
Yeah, I want to go back to the other parts of your question, which is, I think that right now, in spite of the people's frustrations, or in spite of, the division about Israel's campaign and the high, the high Palestinian death count, Israel is enjoying still a lot of support from its allies on the mission of getting Hamas out of Gaza. There isn't anybody who disagrees with that as a goal. But this conversation about the day after, right, the sharp division between what Israel might think it needs for its existential security in Gaza and what the rest of the world will expect, will create a lot of tension between Israel and the international community. And internally, Israel went into the war very divided. United immediately around a very clear, simple goal. But the moment the war is over, right, that question of what next, I think, will reopen a lot of those divisions, but everybody will come to it from a much more fierce position. So I think we're as turbulent as these times are, I think the next phase will also be turbulent, but in a very different way.
Yeah, I think fierce is a very good word to use there. Shira, what about you? What do you think you'll be doing in the immediate day after journalistically, and what do you think this might have changed in the way you approach journalism?
I actually don't know what the end of this. I mean, I don't think any of us can imagine the end of this. I don't know. I honestly don't know if there will be an end. I'm not, of course, at some point the military campaign will end. But I think that for Israel, there's this feeling that if we don't win, October 7th will happen again. It's almost simple in that way. It's a means to the end, not to get October 7th again. So I'm not sure if that question and that equation will go away with the end of this war. Or in short, I don't know what I will be covering the day after. Probably some level of turbulence, like you mentioned, Tovah, internally. And probably also some healing together, because we've seen parts of the society that had turned against each other come out and feel Israeli together again. I mean, just like one example out of 100, the Haredim, who there was a lot of hostility with that community, and we saw them in Zaka, and they did amazing work, gathering the body parts and doing that deed that no one else did. That, I mean, that was them. How has this changed my work? I think it's changed it really, really, really fundamentally. I don't think I had ever really seen myself as, I don't know, my work as important. I mean, I always just saw it as one of, my stories, as one of many stories out there. But I see now that there is so much so much out there, so much kind of not rigorously reported stuff, which is not criticism, Twitter, whatever, things that are not journalism. And now I think there is actually a real kind of cause for journalism to take this role and present these stories as fairly and rigorously and, widely as they possibly can.
Now you're muted, Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
Good. There we are. I muted myself briefly because I needed to sneeze, but I needed help being unmuted, which I've now done. Anshel, a closing thought from you, where you imagine, I think Shira makes a very good point. It's almost impossible to imagine this ending. In a way, we're going to be living in a post-October 7th world, maybe for decades and decades to come. I spoke to a historian this week who thinks this ranks alongside 2 or 3 of the epochal Jewish events of the last century, alongside the Holocaust of 1948. It's one of those, and therefore we're going to be living with it for decades. That's a thought. But to the extent we can imagine it, after the immediate hot phase of this conflict is past, where do you imagine channeling your journalistic energies? And this kind of abstract question, how this might have changed the way you approach what you do and in some ways who we all are?
Well, I think that in the same way I expect, though I don't have very high expectations of the leaders of this country to have a period of reckoning, I think as somebody who's been writing about Israel and about Jews and about everything that's been happening here for the last 27.5 years, I also want to do some reckoning with myself. I think I was wrong about many things I wrote in the years before. I think I was wrong about Israel's reliance on tech, which was so shattered on October 7th. I was wrong about some of my assessments of the place of the Palestinian issue within the broader context of Israel's relationships in the Middle East, how important it would be for Israel's internal affairs. I was wrong about stuff I wrote for the last 10 years about how important or how much of a threat anti-Semitism really is to Jews in Britain and other communities that I visited and wrote about. And this is something that you don't have much time during the war to reckon with all your mistakes or to kind of ask yourself why you wrote what you wrote. But the time to do that will be, well, I agree with Shira, we don't know exactly what the end point, if there will be an end point of this war. But I think anybody who's spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this country needs also a period of reckoning. I mean, I was on book leave on October 7th, and I was writing a book about Jewish fundamentalism, both in Israel and around the world. Obviously, from October 8th, my book leave ended, and I haven't done any work on the book since, and I won't be able to go back to the book immediately when this is over, because I'm going to have to start thinking of, I had the whole concept, the book is half written, I had my research, but, it's not relevant. Obviously, as they say, my problems as a writer don't amount to a hill of beans in this world, but it's, this is, for me, it just means that I have to kind of rethink, maybe write a totally different book, maybe not write the book, but do something else. I don't think that any of us will be the same after this, and that's when I say us, whether we're journalists or in anything we do will be different. I will probably stay a journalist because I don't know how to do anything else, but I'm going to have to totally rethink many things I've written about Israel and about Jews and about Palestinians. Hopefully it'll make me a better journalist. Hopefully people will still want to read what I have to write after that. But there's a long period of soul searching, I think, for anybody who takes their work seriously coming.
Which all of you do. And so thank you to you, the rabbi who nearly was, Anshel Pfeffer, Shira Rubin, Tovah, Lazaroff, and Richard Ferrer with me here in London. We're really grateful to you, especially to our panelists in Israel. It is 22 minutes past 11 at night where you are. Big sacrifice that you did this. There's a closing word from our host, and then for me, saying thank you to all of you and to our audience for those great questions. Aviva, closing word from you.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Jonathan for chairing, as well as to all our panelists. We really appreciate it, because as has become even more clear during this discussion, the toll it has taken, personally reporting for the last 2 months, is not to be underestimated. And the fact that you've been willing to share so openly and sensitively, as well as with taking the time, is something we hugely appreciate. To all our audience, thank you for joining us. We will be sending this recording out to all of you and to others who booked but weren't able to attend in person. Feel free to watch it and share it. We'd like it to be heard. And just to say that in the upcoming issue of Jewish Renaissance, to be published as our winter issue, we're going to be covering what happened on the kibbutzim, with photography for the National Library of Israel. We're working with them to look at what the kibbutzim were as cultural centres, as well as what's happened to them. So do keep an eye out for our next issue. Thank you again to everyone, sending koach, sending gvura, sending strength, sending courage, and wishing you all a happy Hanukkah. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.